Good evening and welcome to Midnight Manuscripts. Today's history story examines the Voynich Manuscript, Beinecke MS 408, strictly from what the records and materials allow. Prague, August 1665. At a desk in the Carolinum, physician and rector Johannes Marcus Marzi seals a Latin letter bound for the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher in Rome. The page notes a curious volume, small folio, dense vellum leaves, drawings of plants and stars, whose meaning has resisted every reader. Marcy adds the report, not proved, that an emperor once paid dearly for it, then closes the wax over the thread. The object he describes is the manuscript now catalogued as Beinecke MS 408. Records show it is a small folio of parchment leaves, roughly the size of a modern hardback, bound today in later boards with a mid-20th century spine. The leaves are animal skin, vellum, not paper, cut and folded into gatherings the medieval book trade called quires. Along the lower margins of many gatherings, a hand added quire numbers. Along the upper corners, a later owner added foliation. Several leaves are missing, and several others expand into complex foldouts that open like a cartographer's map. Before we go further, a quick pause. If you value careful, source-based history, consider subscribing and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This channel exists because curiosity travels farther together than any one manuscript ever did. Before any speculation about what the pages mean, specialists fixed when the parchment was likely prepared. In 2009, an accelerator mass spectrometry test on multiple samples from separate folios placed the animal skins in the early 15th century, with a calibrated range commonly reported as the first half of the 1400s. Scholars debate the exact calendar translation of that range and stress that radiocarbon dates the death of the animal, not the moment of writing, but the result anchors the codex within a century, when Latin Europe wrote on vellum, traded pigments across long routes, and used scripts that modern paleographers can describe with precision. The writing itself, often called Voynichese in modern literature, runs left to right in steady lines, set off by paragraph marks and occasional star-like bullets. Records show a consistent script executed by one or a few practiced hands. There are no spaces between words in the way a printer might enforce them. Instead, there are clusters separated by narrow gaps, and lines justified with the care of a scribe who wishes the column to look even. The ink, examined under magnification and multispectral light by conservation scientists, behaves like a typical iron-gall blend for the text, with carbon-based black used in some drawings and colored mineral or organic pigments applied over the outlines. No modern retouching is evident across the main text block, though later annotations and ownership marks are present and will be treated in due course. The page design follows medieval habits. Many folios open with a large drawing and then columns or blocks of writing fitted around stems, stars, or bathing tubs. The layout implies that the pictures and the text were planned together, outlines first, pigments next, lettering woven through the remaining space. Lines occasionally slip around a painted leaf or curl to accommodate a circular diagram, a behavior common in herbal and astronomical manuscripts where image and explanation were conceived as a unit. Paleographers describe the letter forms as an invented alphabet shaped by a writer trained in the ductus of Latin scripts. The regularity suggests a controlled hand working over a limited time span rather than a miscellany of additions across generations. Scholars debate whether all sections were produced by the same scribe. Some see subtle shifts in stroke and spacing that may indicate more than one contributor, while others argue a single practiced hand, varying speed and attention. What is not in dispute is that the script is unlike any standard medieval Latin, German, Italian, or Czech bookhand, and that the glyph inventory is small enough to invite statistical analysis, yet large enough to resist easy mapping onto a known tongue. Binding and damage tell a second story. Records show wormholes that cross multiple leaves, water staining at outer edges, and grime darkening corners where readers turned the same pages again and again. The sewing stations and quire order indicate that the present binding is not original. The codex was likely rebound after centuries of handling. Foldouts, some with 6 panels, demonstrate a workshop capable of making unusual formats, the kind used for cosmological diagrams or complex botanical plates. Missing leaves, recorded in modern catalogues as gaps in the foliation, warn that the manuscript we hold is a survivor of losses we cannot now repair. Material analysis reaches beyond parchment and ink. Conservators have sampled pigments with non-destructive tools, reporting copper-based greens and blues, iron-based ochres, and carbon blacks common in the 15th century. Scholars debate whether some greens have browned due to the instability of verdigris reacting with the vellum, a familiar problem in medieval manuscripts. No modern synthetic pigment has been confirmed in the main layers, a fact that weighs against a modern forgery. Ultraviolet and infrared imaging reveal erasures, retouching, and faint marginal traces, but nothing that changes the basic impression. This is a coherent, intentionally produced book, whose materials align with a 15th century origin. Dating the parchment to the 1400s does not assign it a place of birth. Specialists at the Beinecke Library caution that scripts and pigments travelled. A scribe active in northern Italy, Bohemia, or the German lands could have obtained similar materials through trading centres that linked monastic houses, urban workshops, and courtly libraries. The choir numbers, often cited for hints of origin, resemble habits seen in Central European manuscripts, but similar numeration appears elsewhere. Folklore claims the book once rested in the court of Rudolf II in Prague, a city famous for collectors of wonders. For now, what can be asserted without overreach is this: the Voynich Manuscript is a small folio, written and drawn on vellum prepared in the early 15th century, assembled as an integrated codex with planned images and text, and preserved through rebinding and losses into the modern era. Its physical state, foldouts, stains, choir numeration, steady script, and medieval pigments, describes a normal manuscript made in an age when such books were laborious but not rare. What is unusual is not its parchment or its paints, but the persistent opacity of its writing. That opacity becomes visible the moment the reader looks past materials to content. The next pages sort themselves into recurring suites of drawings, botanical, celestial, bathing, and pharmaceutical, which shape how researchers describe the book's internal structure. The recurring suites arrange themselves into a working map of the codex. Readers opening the leaves encounter full-page plants, circular diagrams of heavens and calendars, pages of small figures standing in green pools linked by conduits, and later gatherings where trimmed plant parts sit above neat rows of jars and short paragraphs. Records show that this internal pattern, herbal, astronomical, astrological, balneological, pharmaceutical, plus several foldouts and a final cluster of short, starred paragraphs, guides how librarians and researchers describe the book today. The plant pages come first in many modern descriptions. Each folio typically shows one large plant with root, stem, and blossom, outlined in brown ink and washed with greens and earth tones. At a distance, they look like the familiar format of a medieval herbal, where image and brief text stood together as a reference for properties and uses. Up close, difficulties multiply. Many leaves and flowers combine features from different species, and several roots rise into bulbous, almost carved shapes that resist identification. Specialists compare these drawings to medieval herbal traditions, such as the Pseudo-Apuleius corpus and the Tractatus de Herbis. Records show parallels in layout and occasional resemblance in posture, but one-to-one matches have not held. Scholars debate whether the plants represent realistic species now distorted by memory, composites meant to encode properties, or a visual vocabulary for a system no longer known. What is not debated is the consistency of execution, the same careful outline, the same rhythm of captions and paragraphs worked around the stems. Turn the gatherings and the circles begin. Astronomical and astrological diagrams fill the next suite, with starry fields, sun and moon emblems, and, most discussed, zodiac roundels. Records show rings bearing the familiar sequence of signs, ram, bull, twins, and so on, accompanied by radiating bands crowded with small human figures and labels. Scholars debate whether these pages represent a straightforward calendrical schema, months, deacons, or houses, or whether they encode something more particular to a practitioner's notebook. Some labels were likely added or retraced by hands at different moments. Some may be later than the main text. The overall impression is of a working cosmology, concentric order imposed upon time and sky, ready to be cross-referenced against activities, baths, or prescriptions elsewhere in the codex. The most striking leaves for many viewers are those of the so-called balneological section. Here, small nude figures, usually women, stand, sit, or move within green pools connected by tube-like conduits. The pools sometimes resemble tubs. Sometimes they swell into basins or networked vessels joined by pipes that enter or exit at odd angles. Records show that European spa culture and medical bathing traditions thrived in the later Middle Ages and early modern period. Physicians wrote about thermal waters, and towns marked their springs with elaborate facilities. Scholars debate whether these Voynich pages refer to hydrotherapy, to humoral regulation by bathing, or to a symbolic process that uses water and vessels as metaphors. The figures sometimes hold stars or are positioned near circular frames, which has encouraged readers to link baths and calendar, a regimen tied to signs and seasons. No explicit cycle is verified in the text, but the visual pairing of bodies, fluids, and conduits is deliberate and repeated. A shift in scale follows. In what researchers call the pharmaceutical pages, the large, whole plants vanish. Instead, small leaves, roots, and flowers appear as trimmed specimens, neatly grouped above or alongside rows of apothecary-style containers. The jars, some tall, some globular, some with collars or flared lips, resemble the pottery and glass forms depicted in later medical recipe books. Records show short paragraphs nearby, often more numerous and more compact than in the herbal pages. The layout suggests a working section, parts selected, vessels awaiting compounds, text broken into manageable entries. Scholars debate whether these pages represent a later distillation of the preceding herbal material or an independent catalogue keyed to a practitioner's collection. The codex also contains foldouts that transform the reader's sense of scale. The largest, often called the rosette foldout, unfurls into a multi-panel panorama of circular enclosures linked by causeways and bands, some edged with what look like crenellations or wave patterns. At the center sits a wheel. Around it, nodes with starry or architectural textures. Between them, passage-like ribbons. Records show nothing quite like it in standard medieval atlases or cosmographies, though elements echo diagrammatic habits from scholastic science and Mappamundi. Circles nested inside circles, labeled paths, and emblematic gateways. Scholars debate whether the fold-out maps a cosmological itinerary, a mnemonic city, or a conceptual machine for moving between ordered domains. At the back of the book, many short paragraphs, often preceded by star-like marks, conclude the sequence. Modern writers sometimes call these entries recipes, borrowing a term from medical and household books where asterisks or paragraph marks introduced brief instructions. Here, the language remains opaque, but the formatting is recognizable. One thought per line, repetitive initials, clusters that hint at families of preparation. If one accepts the herbal pharmaceutical arc as a movement from plant to part to jar, these starred entries read as the practical end of that process. Scholars debate whether they encode ingredient lists, cautions, or calendrical notes. There is no consensus, only the persistence of a form that medieval readers would have understood as workmanlike and usable. Across all sections, labels cling to stems, stars, and tubs. Their brevity, single or double words written in the same script, frustrates every attempt to anchor the unknown language to a known one. Statistical studies, records show, have measured the distribution of glyphs and word lengths, finding regularities reminiscent of natural languages, yet peculiarities that resist direct mapping. The internal organization only sharpens the paradox. A book that looks like a physician's or naturalist's manual, behaving like practical literature in its layout, but withholding the one thing manuals must provide: readable instruction. Daily life drifts through the margins of these images, whether or not the text yields. The memory of gardens, of apothecaries' benches lined with jars, of market days when roots and dried leaves changed hands. the rhythm of baths kept at town springs, and of calendars marked by saints and seasons. None of this proves the manuscript came from a bath town, a court laboratory, or a monastery infirmary. Specialists at research libraries caution that function cannot be read off pictures alone, but the codex's suites at least show what its maker thought a book should hold: plants, stars, bodies, vessels, steps, materials of a world mapped onto vellum. Because the content is so tantalizing, stories soon gathered around the volume, attaching it to famous collectors and would-be decipherers. By the 1630s in Prague, a man named Georg Baresch would write to a Jesuit in Rome asking for help with an unreadable book, and those letters would carry the manuscript into documented history. The Prague Trail enters the record under three names: Georg, or Jiří, Baresch, Johannes Marcus Marzi, and Athanasius Kircher. Records show that in the late 1630s, Baresch, a Prague alchemist with scholarly contacts, sought help in Rome for an unreadable manuscript in his possession. A surviving letter in Kircher's correspondence from 1639 describes a book filled with unknown writing and strange diagrams, and asks the Jesuit polymath, already reputed for deciphering scripts, to attempt a reading. Chroniclers report that Baresch guarded the volume closely, reluctant to send it, but anxious to learn whether the script matched any language or cipher known at the Collegio Romano. Johannes Marcus Marzi, physician, rector of Charles University, and a friend of Baresch, emerges next. Records show Marzi continued the appeal after Baresch's death, writing again to Kircher about the same enigmatic book. The most important of these letters is dated 19th August 1665. In it, Marzi states plainly that he is forwarding the manuscript to Rome, entrusting it to a bearer, and recounts a report he had heard years earlier that an emperor had once purchased the book for a large sum. Scholars debate the size and conversion of the sum, often cited as 600 ducats, and, more importantly, the reliability of the report itself, which Marzi attributes to a courtly informant now deceased. What the letter secures is less the rumor's truth than the fact of transfer. By late summer 1665, the volume was on its way from Prague to Kircher. That rumor has a precise shape in later retellings. It names the emperor as Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire, a ruler whose court in Prague cultivated collectors of instruments, naturalia, and books. It also supplies the likely conduit of the story, a Bohemian official and patron known to Marzi and to scholars in the city. Records show that Rudolf paid handsomely for rare objects, but no imperial receipt for this manuscript has been found. Specialists emphasize that the claim remains a report, not a ledger entry, and it is in that careful sense that historians repeat it. A remembered assertion in a 17th century letter, not a proved transaction. Another Prague thread touches the faintest traces on the parchment itself. On the first folio of the manuscript, conservation images have long hinted at an erased ex libris in Latin for a figure associated with Rudolf's medical and botanical circles. Jacobus Horcicki de Tepanek, an imperial distiller and later head of the imperial gardens. Records show that some scholars accept the ghosted inscription as genuine, arguing that washing or abrasion obscured it. Others remain skeptical, noting that the reading is contested and that photographic enhancement can mislead the eye. The debate matters because if Horcicki's name did stand on the page, even briefly, it would anchor the book in a circle close to Rudolf's court and to Prague's learned practitioners. As it stands, the mark is suggestive but not universally accepted as proof. While controversies accumulate, the letters themselves keep the story steady. The 1630s correspondence shows Baresch's initial outreach. Marzi's letters from the 1640s and 1660s sustain the link. The 1665 letter documents the handover. The addressee, Kircher, was a prolific Jesuit scholar in Rome, famed for encyclopedic interests in languages, natural philosophy, and antiquities. Records show that he cultivated correspondence across Europe, gathered manuscripts energetically, and maintained a museum-like collection attached to the Collegio Romano. It is to that collegiate environment, and eventually to Kircher's private papers, that the Prague book was consigned. Daily life underlies the passage. A manuscript left a Central European city whose university terms, guild fairs, and court politics shaped when couriers travelled and what routes they took. A Jesuit post system, embedded in a wider mesh of merchants and embassy traffic, carried letters and parcels south into the Papal States. Seals cracked in Roman chambers in which other curiosities already lay, ancient inscriptions, exotic specimens, and the textual debris of Europe's learned republic of letters. For Prague physicians and Roman Jesuits alike, books were instruments, not ornaments. Even an unreadable codex might promise a key to plants, stars, or medicines, if only a learned reader could unlock its language. Once in Rome, the manuscript disappeared from public view, but not, it seems, from scholarly notice. Records show that Kircher's circle attempted readings of scripts from the Near East and Egypt, and that he confidently announced decipherments that modern philology does not confirm. Scholars debate how much attention he gave to the Prague Codex, or whether he stored it among papers he intended to revisit. No published account by Kircher of a successful reading exists, and no index entry in his printed work securely identifies the manuscript by description. But the physical fate of similar items in his possession is well documented. When Jesuit collections shifted in the 18th and 19th centuries, the contents of Kircher's museum and archive followed the order's institutional fortunes. Between Prague's letters and the manuscript's modern reappearance lies that institutional path. The Jesuit order's suppression in the 18th century, the dispersal and reorganization of its collections, and the 19th century consolidation of holdings into repositories around Rome created pockets of manuscripts that could be forgotten and then rediscovered. Specialists trace the likeliest route, from Kircher's papers at the Collegio Romano to storage at the order's country property at Frascati, Villa Mondragone, where generations later a cache of manuscripts would be examined by dealers and scholars. What the Prague decades establish is a grounded provenance up to the handover to Kircher and a plausible environment in which the book could rest for centuries without public cataloguing. They also frame two claims that will shadow every discussion: the reported imperial purchase under Rudolf II and the contested ownership mark of Horciki de Tepanek. Neither is dismissed, neither is treated as proven. Both are weighed against the firm fact of the 1665 letter and the Jesuit custodianship that followed. From that custodianship, the next chapter opens in Italy, where Jesuit shelves and country house cabinets preserved the volume until a traveling book dealer in the early 20th century encountered it among other forgotten bindings and carried it into the modern market. The traveling book dealer was Wilfrid Voynich. Records show that in 1912 he obtained a cache of manuscripts from the Jesuit order at Villa Mondragone, an expansive country house above Frascati that by the 19th century served both as a Jesuit residence and a place where the order stored books inherited from earlier Roman collections. Among those bindings lay the unreadable codex sent from Prague to Athanasius Kircher 2.5 centuries earlier. Voynich purchased a group of volumes. Inside one, he found the vellum manuscript with its unknown script and diagrams, together with papers that included Johannes Marcus Marci's letter recounting the report of an imperial purchase. The book's modern name would follow from that moment, the Voynich Manuscript. Villa Mondragone's shelves and cabinets explain how a 17th century curiosity could pass into the 20th with little public notice. The Jesuit order preserved teaching materials, correspondence, and manuscripts connected to scholars like Kircher. When the order's fortunes shifted after the 18th century suppression and later restorations, portions of those holdings migrated to outlying properties. Records show that dealers and scholars periodically examined such stores when institutions sought to raise funds or to consolidate collections. Voynich, already seasoned in negotiating with religious houses and libraries, recognized value in clusters. A codex of interest might be embedded among more routine theological or humanist works. The cipher manuscript, with its circles and plants, looked unlike anything else in the lot, and unlike the Latin and Greek codices he regularly traded in London and New York. Back in his shop, Voynich began the practical work of description and promotion that defined the early 20th century rare book trade. He took careful measurements, counted and recounted folios, noted foldouts, and inspected inks and pigments with a loupe under good light. He studied the marginal numbers and quire marks and compared the ductus of the hand across sections. Records show he commissioned high-quality photographic copies, then called photostats, of selected pages and later of the entire book. These served two purposes: a preservation copy he could show without risking the original, and a portable dossier he could mail to scholars who might attempt a reading. Voynich also articulated a hypothesis about authorship intended to spark interest. He advanced the idea, never proved, that the manuscript could be the work of the 13th century English Franciscan Roger Bacon, a figure long associated in popular imagination with experimental science and secret writing. The path by which he reached the suggestion combined the Prague rumor about an imperial purchase, the manuscript's scientific imagery, and a cluster of historical associations linking Bacon to optical studies and ciphers. Scholars debate whether the attribution reflected genuine conviction or strategic marketing. Either way, it entered the public story early and would shape newspaper headlines and lectures for years. Records show that later scientific dating of the parchment would place the skins in the 15th century, not the 13th, but that result lay decades ahead. In the 1910s, the Bacon hypothesis gave journalists and classicists alike a name to anchor an otherwise anonymous book. The codex's physical presence unsettled even experienced readers. Dealers and librarians were accustomed to unfamiliar scripts, Gothic cursives, humanistic hands, Syriac, Arabic, but this alphabet fell into no established class. The page design belonged to a recognizable genre of practical books: herbal, astrological, balneological, pharmaceutical. Yet the captions and paragraphs refused to yield to Latin or any Romance language. Records show that Voynich, alert to the scholarly promise, sought out cryptanalysts, classicists, and orientalists on both sides of the Atlantic. He allowed researchers to handle the manuscript under supervision and sent photostat packets to those who could not travel. The combination of secrecy and access mirrored the era's learned networks, a coveted object guarded by its owner, and a field of correspondence brought into the circle through copies and letters. Daily routines of the trade left their marks on the book's dossier. The manuscript travelled with customs papers and insurance receipts. It sat under glass at quiet showings. It returned to a safe each evening in a London office a short walk from the British Museum's reading room. Letters carried impressions and tentative readings between London, Philadelphia, and New York. In library offices, curators compared the unfamiliar glyphs to samples in their script charts. In university clubs, invited audiences listened to preliminary lectures about the mystery of a book that looked medieval yet defied every cataloguing category. The name Voynich Manuscript entered print through this mixture of catalogue descriptions, press notices, and scholarly exchanges. Records show that Voynich's circulars to clients in the trade used a descriptive style, both sober and enticing. A small folio on vellum, numerous botanical and cosmographical drawings, text in an unknown script, provenance linked to the Collegio Romano. The language did not promise a solution. It promised an opportunity, the chance that someone, somewhere, might recognize a cipher key, a linguistic family, or a historical context that would bring the pages into speech. Because provenance often determines value and credibility, the Jesuit link